The stadium is electric. Thousands of fans are on their feet, screaming so loud it feels like the ground might shake beneath them. The air smells faintly of popcorn and sweat, a mix that somehow makes the moment feel even more real. At the center of it all, Thomas Wilson stands alone, staring down the goalkeeper. His heart pounds so hard he can hear it over the noise, a steady drumbeat matching every breath he takes. This is it. One shot, one chance to change everything. But it's not just about winning the game. For Thomas, this moment carries the weight of years. Years of being told he wasn't good enough, smart enough, or right enough because of the color of his skin. Years of fighting against odds stacked higher than any mountain. As he places the ball carefully on the penalty spot, flashes of his past flicker through his mind like scenes from an old movie reel. He sees Coach Johnson's face, red with anger, yelling at him after practice. "You'll never make it, Wilson. You don't belong here." He hears the whispers of his teammates behind his back, mocking him for being different, calling him names meant to cut deeper than any blade. And then there's the memory of his childhood home, a tiny apartment in Detroit where money was always tight. His mom sewing patches onto his worn-out shoes because they couldn't afford new ones. His dad working double shifts just to keep food on the table. Football had been his escape, but even that came with pain. Playing alone in their cracked backyard with a deflated ball, dreaming of something bigger while the world seemed determined to hold him down. Now, standing here under the bright lights, those memories threaten to pull him under. Can he silence the voices telling him he doesn't deserve this? Can he push aside the doubt planted by people who refuse to see his worth? The whistle blows, snapping him back to reality. It's time. Thomas takes a deep breath, his eyes locked on the ball. Sweat drips down his forehead, stinging his eyes, but he doesn't blink. Not now. The crowd holds its collective breath. Every second stretches out like hours. Will he score? Or will the ghosts of his past rise up to haunt him one last time? Stay tuned. Because this isn't just a story about football. It's about proving everyone wrong when no one believes in you. Let's rewind the clock. Before Thomas Wilson became the name on everyone's lips, before the trophies and the fame, there was a boy growing up in Detroit, a city known for its grit, but also for swallowing dreams whole. His neighborhood wasn't exactly what you'd call picturesque. Cracked sidewalks, boarded-up windows, and the constant hum of distant traffic defined the streets where Thomas spent his childhood. It was the kind of place where hope often felt like a luxury most couldn't afford. But even in that tough environment, something inside Thomas refused to let go of his dream. Thomas came from a family that worked hard just to survive. His mom cleaned houses during the day and stitched uniforms at a factory late into the night. His dad drove a delivery truck all week and picked up shifts as a janitor on weekends. They did everything they could to give their kids a shot at a better life, but money was always tight. Hand-me-down clothes were the norm. Jeans patched so many times they barely resembled jeans anymore. Shirts faded from too many washes. Shoes? Forget about it. New ones were out of the question. When Thomas's sneakers finally gave out, his mom would sit by the dim light of an old lamp, threading needle through fabric to patch them back together again. Despite all this, there was one thing no one could take away from Thomas: his love for football. He didn't have fancy gear or access to proper training facilities. All he had was a deflated ball he found in a dumpster once. It wobbled when he kicked it, and the uneven patch of dirt in his backyard that passed for a field. For goals, he used 2 crooked sticks tied together with twine. To anyone else, it might have looked pathetic, but to Thomas, it was everything. That little corner of the world was his sanctuary, the one place where he could forget about bills and hunger and just be free. Of course, things weren't easy outside his backyard either. Growing up black in a predominantly white neighborhood meant facing challenges most kids shouldn't have to think about. Street games with other neighborhood kids should have been fun, right? But more often than not, they turned sour. Some of the boys wouldn't pass him the ball, not because he was bad, but because of the color of his skin. Others called him names, words designed to cut deep and make him feel small. "You don't belong here," one kid sneered once, loud enough for everyone to hear. Those words stuck with Thomas long after the game ended. Loneliness became a frequent companion. While other kids went home to warm meals and laughter around the dinner table, Thomas often sat alone in his room, staring at posters of famous football players taped to his walls. Those athletes seemed untouchable, larger than life. How could someone like him ever reach those heights? But instead of letting despair win, Thomas channeled his pain into determination. If no one believed in him, fine. He'd believe in himself twice as hard. Every evening after school, while other kids played video games or hung out at the park, Thomas trained. Alone. He practiced dribbling between rocks scattered across the yard, imagining defenders trying to steal the ball from him. He worked on shooting accuracy, aiming for the space between the two sticks until his legs burned and his lungs begged for air. And when the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving only shadows behind, he'd lie on the grass, staring up at the stars, whispering promises to himself. Promises that someday, somehow, he'd show the world what he was made of. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't easy. But every kick of that battered old ball carried a piece of his soul. Every drop of sweat soaked into the dirt beneath his feet was a testament to his refusal to give up. Even then, as a scrawny kid with holes in his shoes and dreams bigger than his circumstances, Thomas Wilson was building the foundation for something extraordinary. And maybe, just maybe, that's why years later, standing on that championship field, he didn't crumble under the pressure. Because deep down, he'd already faced far worse and come out stronger every time. High school was supposed to be different. For Thomas, it wasn't just another chapter in his life. It was a chance to rewrite the story people had written for him. He joined the football team with one goal in mind: to prove himself, to show everyone that he belonged, not just on the field but in the game of life. But what he found instead was a whole new set of obstacles, ones that cut deeper than any he'd faced before. Coach Johnson was the first hurdle. From day one, it was clear where his loyalties lay. The white players got the glory positions: quarterback, striker, center forward. They were handed starting spots without question, while Thomas, despite his speed and skill, was relegated to the sidelines. "You're better off on defense," Coach Johnson told him once, dismissively waving him away during tryouts. Defense? Sure, fine. Whatever kept him on the team. But even there, he noticed how little trust the coach placed in him. Then came the games. Time and again, Thomas would score crucial goals or make game-changing plays, only to find himself benched afterward. It didn't matter how well he performed. His efforts seemed invisible to Coach Johnson. After one particularly frustrating match where Thomas single-handedly turned the tide by scoring 2 goals in the final minutes, he approached the coach, hoping for some recognition. Instead, all he got was a cold glare and a curt, "Don't get cocky, Wilson." But the coach wasn't the only problem. His teammates weren't exactly rolling out the welcome mat either. At first, Thomas thought maybe they just needed time to warm up to him. Maybe if he worked harder, trained longer, showed them what he was capable of, things would change. Spoiler alert, they didn't. During practice, passes meant for him would suddenly veer off course, landing safely at someone else's feet. In locker room huddles, he'd stand awkwardly on the edge of the group, excluded from conversations and strategies. And then there were the whispers, the kind you're not supposed to hear but can't unhear. One afternoon, after a tough loss, Thomas lingered near the lockers, pretending to tie his shoelaces so he could listen in. "He's holding us back," one teammate muttered, loud enough for others to nod along. "What does he think he's doing out there? He doesn't even know how to play." Another chimed in, "Yeah, maybe we should tell coach to bench him permanently." That last comment hit like a punch to the gut. Thomas clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay calm. Walking away felt like losing, but staying would have been worse. The isolation gnawed at him. There were days when he wondered if it was worth it, if fighting this uphill battle against prejudice and favoritism was really going to lead anywhere. But every time doubt crept in, something inside him pushed back harder. He reminded himself why he started playing football in the first place. Not for validation, but because it made him feel alive. Because deep down, he knew he was good, better than most. And someday, somehow, the world would see it too. So, while his teammates went home after practice, laughing and joking like nothing was wrong, Thomas stayed behind. He practiced alone under the dim orange glow of streetlights, long after the rest of the team had left. Sometimes, he'd bring that same old deflated ball from his childhood, dribbling between cracks in the pavement as cars whizzed past. Other times, he'd run sprints down empty streets, pushing his body until his lungs burned and his legs threatened to give out. Each session became a silent promise, to himself, to his family, and to anyone who ever doubted him, that he wouldn't quit. There were moments, though, when the weight of it all felt unbearable. One night, after an especially grueling practice where he'd been ignored yet again, Thomas sat on the curb outside the school, staring at his worn-out shoes. Tears welled up in his eyes, blurring the neon lights reflecting off the wet asphalt. He wanted to scream, to let out all the frustration and anger building inside him. But instead, he closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and whispered to himself, "They don't get to decide my future." And that's what kept him going. Not the hope of fame or fortune, but the burning desire to prove them wrong. Every late-night training session, every lonely moment spent dreaming of something bigger, brought him closer to the person he was meant to become. Even when the world tried to erase him, Thomas refused to disappear. Looking back, those high school years weren't just about surviving discrimination. They were about learning resilience, about finding strength in places no one else bothered to look. Because somewhere beneath the pain and rejection, Thomas Wilson was building the fire that would eventually light up stadiums across the country. Little did he know, his breakthrough was just around the corner. It was supposed to be just another regional tournament, a chance for local high school teams to show off their skills and maybe earn a little recognition. For Thomas, though, it felt like the most important game of his life. Word had spread that scouts from Dallas FC were coming to town. This wasn't some small-time recruiter. This was one of the biggest clubs in the country, known for discovering raw talent and turning it into gold. If Thomas could catch their eye, it might be his ticket out of Detroit, out of the shadow of prejudice, and into a world where he could finally shine. But there was a problem. Coach Johnson. The morning of the tournament, as the team gathered on the field for warm-ups, Thomas overheard the coach talking to one of the assistant coaches near the sidelines. "Don't worry about Wilson," Coach Johnson said with a dismissive wave. "He's got potential, sure, but he's inconsistent. Keep your eyes on the starters. They're the real deal." Thomas clenched his jaw, forcing himself not to react. He'd heard comments like that before, but this time they stung more than usual. These weren't just words. They were barriers standing between him and his dream. Still, he reminded himself why he was here. This wasn't about proving Coach Johnson wrong. It was about proving himself right. The match began, and immediately, Thomas noticed the scouts sitting in the bleachers, clipboards in hand, jotting down notes. His heart raced every time he glanced their way. Would they see him? Or would they fall for the narrative Coach Johnson was trying so hard to sell, that Thomas wasn't worth their time? On the field, things didn't start well. His teammates barely passed him the ball, sticking to the same pattern of exclusion they'd perfected during practice. When he did get possession, defenders swarmed him like bees to honey, clearly instructed to shut him down at all costs. It was frustrating, infuriating even. But Thomas refused to let it break him. Then, midway through the second half, everything changed. A loose ball rolled toward the midfield, and Thomas sprinted after it, leaving two defenders in the dust with a quick burst of speed. As soon as he touched the ball, something clicked. He weaved through opponents like water flowing around rocks, his movements fluid and precise. The crowd gasped as he sent a perfect cross to a teammate who scored the tying goal. Moments later, during a counterattack, Thomas found himself face-to-face with the opposing goalkeeper. Without hesitation, he struck a powerful shot that sailed into the top corner of the net. The stadium erupted in cheers, but Thomas barely heard them. His focus was on the scouts. Had they seen it? Had they noticed what he could do? As the final whistle blew, signaling the end of the match, Thomas walked off the field feeling equal parts exhausted and hopeful. He spotted one of the scouts approaching him, clipboard tucked under his arm. For a moment, panic set in. Was this good news or bad? "Thomas Wilson?" the scout asked, extending a hand. "Yes, sir," Thomas replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "You've got raw skill, something we don't see every day," the scout said, nodding approvingly. "We'd like you to come to Dallas for a trial next week. Think you can handle that?" Thomas blinked, stunned. A trial? With Dallas FC? He nodded quickly, almost too overwhelmed to speak. Yes, sir, absolutely. Walking away, Thomas couldn't stop smiling. This was it, the moment he'd been waiting for. All those lonely nights practicing under streetlights, all the times he'd been overlooked and underestimated, had led to this. For the first time in a long time, hope didn't feel like a distant dream. It felt real, tangible. And as he looked back at the field where he'd spent years fighting for scraps of attention, he knew one thing for certain. His journey was only beginning. Dallas FC believed in him. Now, it was up to him to prove they were right. Dallas FC's training camp was nothing like Thomas had ever experienced. The sprawling fields, state-of-the-art facilities, and rows of perfectly polished boots felt like stepping into another world, a far cry from the cracked pavement and makeshift goals of his childhood backyard. But while the surroundings were impressive, they came with a price tag: pressure. Intense, unrelenting pressure. From day one, Thomas realized he wasn't just competing against himself anymore. He was up against some of the best young players in the country, kids who'd grown up with private coaches, top-tier equipment, and endless support systems. These weren't street footballers making do with what they had. These were athletes bred for greatness. Every drill, every scrimmage, every moment on the field felt like a test designed to weed out the weak. And Thomas? He stuck out like a sore thumb. The first few days were brutal. During drills, he struggled to keep up with the pace. His technique, once his greatest strength, suddenly felt sloppy compared to the precision of his peers. In scrimmages, defenders seemed to anticipate his every move, shutting him down before he could even think about shooting. It didn't help that whispers followed him everywhere he went. "Is this the guy they brought in from Detroit?" someone muttered during lunch one afternoon. "He doesn't look like much." Self-doubt crept in like an unwelcome guest. For the first time in years, Thomas questioned whether he truly belonged here. Was Coach Johnson right all along? Had Dallas FC made a mistake by inviting him? Imposter syndrome gnawed at him, whispering cruel truths, or lies, he couldn't quite untangle. But then, something shifted. It started with Marcus Kane, a seasoned player nearing the end of his career but still sharp as ever. Marcus had seen potential in Thomas from the beginning. One evening after practice, he pulled Thomas aside. "You've got raw talent," Marcus said, leaning casually against the fence surrounding the pitch. "But talent alone won't cut it here. You need discipline, focus. Let me show you a few things." What followed were late-night sessions under the floodlights, just the two of them. Marcus taught Thomas advanced techniques: how to read defenders' body language, how to create space when there seemed to be none, how to strike the ball with pinpoint accuracy. But more importantly, he taught him mental toughness. "Football isn't just played with your feet," Marcus explained one night, tossing Thomas a water bottle. "It's played up here." He tapped his temple. "If you let doubt win, you've already lost. Trust yourself. Believe in your game." Slowly but surely, Thomas began to adapt. His movements became sharper, his decisions quicker. He learned to silence the noise, the critics, the doubters, even the voice inside his head telling him he wasn't good enough. Each small victory built confidence, brick by brick, until he no longer felt like the outsider looking in. Still, the competition remained fierce. Every player wanted the same thing: a spot on Dallas FC's roster. Tryouts loomed closer, and tension filled the air like static electricity. Coaches pushed them harder than ever, pitting teammates against each other in grueling matches meant to simulate real game scenarios. One particularly intense session stands out in Thomas's memory. Down by a goal with seconds left on the clock, he found himself face-to-face with the opposing team's star defender. The crowd, a mix of staff and fellow trainees, watched silently, holding their breath. This wasn't just a drill, it was a chance to prove himself yet again. Thomas faked left, then spun right, leaving the defender stumbling behind him. With no time to hesitate, he unleashed a blistering shot that hit the back of the net. Silence gave way to cheers as his teammates rushed over, slapping him on the back. Even the coaches nodded approvingly. For the first time since arriving, Thomas allowed himself to believe. Maybe he did belong here. As tryouts approached, anticipation buzzed through the camp like wildfire. Everyone knew the stakes: Only a handful of players would make the final cut. For Thomas, this wasn't just about proving himself to Dallas FC. It was about proving himself to the world, about showing everyone who doubted him that he wasn't just good enough. He was extraordinary. The big game, the ultimate decider, was coming. And Thomas Wilson was ready. The stadium lights burned brighter than ever as Thomas stepped up to the penalty spot, the weight of the championship resting on his shoulders. Sweat dripped down his face, stinging his eyes, but he didn't blink. Not now. The roar of the crowd had faded into an eerie silence, so thick you could hear the faint rustle of the wind catching the corner flags. Every eye in the arena was fixed on him. Teammates, opponents, coaches, fans, all holding their breath. This wasn't just a kick, it was redemption wrapped in leather and laces. Thomas closed his eyes for a split second, letting the moment wash over him. He thought about every insult hurled his way, every time he'd been benched or ignored because of the color of his skin. He thought about his parents working double shifts, his mom sewing patches onto worn-out shoes, his dad telling him, "Don't let anyone tell you what you can't do." He thought about Marcus's words, "Trust yourself." The whistle blew, sharp and clear, slicing through the tension like a knife. Time slowed. Thomas exhaled, planted his foot, and struck the ball with everything he had. Every ounce of pain, anger, and determination channeled into that single motion. The ball rocketed forward, curving perfectly past the diving goalkeeper and slamming into the back of the net. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then, chaos erupted. The crowd exploded into cheers so loud they shook the stands. His teammates sprinted toward him, tackling him in a heap of hugs and shouts. Even those who once doubted him clapped, their faces lit with awe. For the first time, Thomas saw respect in their eyes. Not pity, not dismissal, but genuine admiration. As he stood there, arms raised to the sky, tears streaming down his cheeks, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Peace. All the doubters, all the critics, all the voices that told him he didn't belong, they were silenced. In that moment, Thomas Wilson wasn't just a player. He was a symbol of perseverance, proof that no obstacle is insurmountable if you refuse to give up. And the world was finally watching. Thomas Wilson's journey wasn't just about football. It was about rewriting the script life had handed him. From a scrawny kid kicking a deflated ball in a Detroit backyard to becoming a professional star signed by Dallas FC, his story was one of grit, resilience, and unshakable belief. Fame didn't just change his bank account, it transformed his entire world. For the first time, he could give his parents the life they'd sacrificed everything for. No more patched-up shoes or secondhand clothes, just comfort, security, and pride. The day Thomas brought his parents to tour Dallas FC's headquarters, their eyes sparkled with tears. His mom hugged him so tight he thought she'd never let go. "We always knew you'd make it," she whispered, her voice trembling. But Thomas knew better. They hadn't just known. They'd fought for it, prayed for it, worked themselves to the bone to keep his dreams alive. Seeing them smile now made every struggle worth it. But Thomas's impact went beyond his family. Back in Detroit, kids who looked like him started showing up at local fields with posters of his face taped to their lockers. Parents told stories of how their children suddenly believed they could achieve greatness too. "If Thomas can do it," one boy said during an interview, "then maybe I can too." That's when Thomas realized his legacy wasn't just about scoring goals. It was about breaking barriers and lighting a path for others to follow. As he stood on the field after another game, staring out at the sea of fans chanting his name, Thomas felt something deeper than pride. He felt purpose. Life had thrown everything it could at him: poverty, racism, doubt. But none of it broke him. Instead, it forged him into someone stronger, someone unstoppable. To anyone watching this story, here's the truth. The road won't be easy. There will be people who don't believe in you, moments when you'll question yourself, and obstacles that feel impossible to overcome. But don't stop fighting. Don't stop dreaming. Because somewhere out there, someone needs to see you succeed. Not just to cheer for you, but to remind themselves that they can succeed too. So, what's your next move? Share this story. Let it inspire someone else to keep going, no matter what. Because sometimes, All it takes is one person proving the doubters wrong to change the game for everyone. So, what do you think? What would you have done if you were in Thomas's shoes? Would you have kept fighting when the odds felt impossible? Or would frustration have gotten the better of you? It's easy to say we'd push through, but how many times do we let fear, doubt, or even prejudice stop us from chasing our dreams? Thomas didn't just overcome obstacles, he turned them into fuel for his fire. And that's something all of us can learn from. Now it's your turn to weigh in. Share your thoughts below. What part of the story resonated most with you? Was it Thomas's determination to prove himself? The way he silenced his critics with sheer hard work? Or maybe it was the moment his family finally got to see their sacrifices pay off. Whatever it is, let us know. Your voice matters, and your story might inspire someone else watching this video right now. If you loved this story, stay tuned for more tales of courage and triumph. We've got plenty more journeys like Thomas's, stories about people who refuse to give up, no matter how tough things got. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out, and share this video with someone who needs a reminder that they're capable of greatness too. Oh, and one last thing. Don't forget to hit the like button. It lets us know you want to hear more stories like this. Together, let's keep spreading hope, inspiration, and proof that anything is possible if you're willing to fight for it. So, what are you waiting for? Drop a comment, share this story, and let's keep the conversation going.